Hello, Buckeyes, and welcome to the first step of our research method process. So I talked about how we're going to restructure class last time. Now what we're going to do is we're going to start getting into each of the different steps. And our first step that we need to accomplish is revising our 2x2 factorial design to be a one-factor design. And the objective behind this video will be talking about how to do that. And in doing that, we're going to do is kind of take one step backwards, talk about the 2x2 design, and then what we're going to do is start moving forward in terms of talking about the one factor design. So I'll try to make this as clear as possible. There'll be parts that'll be a little unclear, but you can always go back through it. But you'll be able to kind of go through the whole video and see how it all comes together in the end. So let's start first with kind of just the overview of the steps as a whole. So I want to talk about this just a touch more, make sure that we're set here. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to break down our research project into multiple steps. And doing this allows us to kind of make things a bit more manageable. So we're kind of taking this whole research project, this whole research progression, and trying to put it in manageable chunks where I'll give you enough information that you can move through it, but not too much. So we'll try to balance things out as best as possible. And this is really reflective of how research kind of gets done in each of these different sections. And so there may be a lot of steps that may look overwhelming, but hang in there though as we're going through the process. Now, as we go through each of these steps, it's your job and your group's job to stay on track. So the idea behind this is that I didn't want to set a schedule that you guys had to adhere to because I know there's a lot of different things going on in your personal lives, being able to manage different classes, things like that. So I didn't want to set things like we had before, but we do need to progress through each of these steps and do a good job of this. And so it's your job with your group to stay on track. If you do all these things at the last minute, it is not going to work for your paper. It's not going to work for the final project. But if you're tackling as you can, as quickly as you can, doing a thorough job, you're going to be in much better shape. And with that being said, I'll do my best to post information ahead of when you need it. So I'll try to stay ahead of you guys so that as you're ready to go to the next step, that step is sitting there waiting for you. So bear with me. I hopefully can stick with that as closely as I can, but that's my objective for you guys. Continuing to think with kind of the overview of the steps, okay? What I want you to do is for each step, be thoughtful and careful. So the idea is that spend the time thinking through that step, considering the information, answering questions carefully, doing a good job submitting information to me. And the reason why I want you guys to be really sure to do that is because being thoughtful and careful in that step will make things go that much better later on when you get to the paper, when you're processing things. If you're hurrying through, doing this at the last minute, it's going to be hard to really understand it and process it. So please be careful. As you go through each step, feel free to contact me if you have questions. Okay? The whole idea behind this is that the video should set you up. Working with your group should help you kind of fill in the information, but contact me if you have questions. I'm expecting you guys to have questions. So we'll talk a little more about that kind of later at the end of the video, but contact me as we're going through. This is not the only information I'll be giving you guys. Happy to support you other ways. When you believe you completed the step, you're going to email me the information. So when you believe you completed the step, and I'll talk about what the specifics are for this first step at the end of the video, what I want you to do is email me that information, and I'll do one of two things. One is I'll provide feedback on how to make the revisions if it's necessary. So if there's more information you need, if it needs to be clarified, I'll give you comments on that, send it back to your group, have you guys work on it. Or what I'll do is I'll confirm you've completed the step successfully, which means you're then signed off to go ahead and go on to the next step. So let's talk first about our first step that we're going to be tackling here. And with our first step, we're going to do is kind of go a little bit backwards. We're going to talk about how we were talking originally about our 2x2 design, refresh your memory on what that looks like. It's been over 20 days since we've talked about this. And then we're going to talk about how we're going to modify it to be a little bit more simple of a design that'll be helpful for you as we move forward. And we'll talk a little bit about why we're making that change. So originally we developed a 2x2 factorial design. What this means is that we're going to look at two variables, and for each of those variables, it was going to have two levels. Now, the reason why we're going to do this is the most commonly used design in social psychology, at least arguably. And so that's why I wanted us to work on this. I thought it would be the most beneficial for us and kind of very classic of social psychology and psychology as a whole. Now, unfortunately, though, this is something that involves looking at interactions, how these variables are interacting with each other. And it's something where I think it's a little more difficult than we can handle when we're not able to meet with each other. You guys, we're doing a great job getting a handle on the design, going through and processing your outcomes, working with those. I think that was great. We were on the right track beforehand, but to be able to understand these interactions, to break them down from the statistical standpoint, all the other pieces that go into it, I think make things a little bit more challenging than we can handle. So what we're going to do is we're going to simplify our design so that we'll only look at one factor, but in this case, we're going to have three conditions. So if nothing else, you can think about this as a revision that we're only going to have three conditions that we're going to be comparing to each other. And the reason why I think this is a good approach is it still gives us a robust test of our research questions. It still is typical of research that we see within social psychology, and it's a little bit more straightforward. It's going to be a little easier to walk through while still giving you guys a chance to have a good research experience. I didn't think it made any sense to stick with the factorial design and just be confused through the whole process. Hopefully this is a little more straightforward. So what I want to do is I want to walk through how we're going to make this transition between the 2x2 factorial design that you put together and how we're going to make it a one factor design with three conditions. And to start with this, what I want to do is I want to talk about that factorial design. And with this factorial design, what I want to do is kind of highlight just kind of the overall concept and idea here. Then we'll do is we'll work our way through it, and I'll give you the example that I had in class. So the first idea here is with the factorial design is we have two factors. Here we have factor 1, and here we have factor 2. Now within each of these factors, we have two levels of it. Okay, so we have level 1 here, level 2. Same thing down here, level 1, level 2. Okay, so this idea is that for each factor, we manipulated it to have two conditions. Now, the overall objective behind a factorial design is to see how the effect of one variable depends on the level of the other variable. So the idea here is when we look at factor 1, we look at level 1 and level 2. We want to compare these two to each other. How do they compare to each other when we look at it level 1 versus when we're looking at it level 2? Okay, are they operating the same, or is maybe there's a smaller difference here compared to a bigger difference here? Okay, so we want to see how the level at which factor 2 is at influences the difference between level 1, level 2 for our first factor. So this is kind of conceptually what we're thinking about here. The idea here is that we're kind of processing at a larger scale. Now let's kind of work through a little bit of kind of the numbers here and kind of process it another way. So here we can do is we can look at our specific example that we're going through. Okay, so in our example here, we're going to look at the difference in level 1 versus level 2 for this first factor, starting first with level 1. And here we compare these two means. Okay, so we see that for level 1 versus level 2 of the first factor, there's really no difference when looking at level 1 of the second factor. Now, when we look at level 2, though, here's where we start to see our difference. Okay, we start to see this difference here where now the difference between level 1 and level 2 does seem to emerge, and we start to see that this is because it's at a different level, level 2. Okay, so for some reason, level 1 doesn't really cause a difference in the first factor. There's no difference between level 1 and level 2. When we go to our second factor, at the second level, suddenly there's something in that condition that's causing there to be a separation between these two different levels. So when we process this, and we clear it out just a little bit more, okay, we can see that really, we see an equal amount here, but in this case we see level 2 is greater than level 1, but only when this factor 2 is at level 2. So the idea here is there's some combination of level 2 with level 2 that's producing kind of this strong response. Okay. So this works us through things kind of larger and conceptually. If this is a little bit unclear, that's okay, you're fine. We'll do is we'll go through now the example I generated in class. So we'll kind of be a little more specific, and hopefully you'll remember this example from way back when. Hopefully it'll try to solidify what we're talking about in these factorial designs. So in my design, I was interested in looking at two factors at the same time. The first factor I was interested in was the group member behavior. This is actually research I'm developing right now. And what I'm interested in looking at is what happens when you have a group member who stays in the group, so pretty typical groups, everyone works together, versus you have a group member who leaves the group. And so you might say that, hey, you have 3 people working together, and suddenly one of the group members leaves. And so I'm interested if that potentially causes more negative mood. Might you feel more negative when someone leaves the group instead of staying in the group? Now, one of the things I think makes a difference is whether that group member who we're thinking about is either burdensome or non-burdensome. Okay, so non-burdensome meaning that they're contributing to the group, they're helpful and beneficial to the group, versus burdensome being, well, hey, they're causing problems, they're making it difficult for the group. It's not really a great situation. And so these were kind of the approximate means that I laid out for this situation. Okay, we'll walk through each of the conditions step by step, and then we'll start to look at how the factors are going to depend on each other. So when we look at where the group member, the target group member we're thinking about is non-burdensome and they stay in the group, this should lead to very little negative affect. This is a good experience. But when that group member leaves and they were a good group member, okay, so they weren't burdensome, you start to feel more negative. When we go down here to look at the second level of the second factor, we see that when someone's burdensome and they stay in the group, that causes a lot of negative affect. We've all had that group member we don't like cause us to feel negative. But when they leave the group and they're burdensome, it might be a little bit of relief. And so we can process this a little bit more and think it through. And what we basically have here is that we see that there's a difference between staying in a group versus the group member leaves when there's no burden. Okay? We also see it here that there's a difference. Okay? We also see that there's a difference between all the group members staying versus one leaving when they're burdensome. The trick to this, though, let's see if we can get things to work the way we want to, is that the pattern changes. There's more negative affect when the group member leaves compared to when they stay in the group when they're not burdensome. We feel bad when a good group member leaves. But when that group member is burdensome, we're more negative when they stay in the group versus we might feel less negative, a little bit more relief because that person leaves. So the overarching idea here, processing this through, is that we can see how the group member's behavior, whether they stay in a group versus one of the group members leaves, the impact of that on negative affect depends on whether that group member was burdensome or non-burdensome. So this goes through and reminds us kind of what the interaction design looked like. Now here's where we're going to make the transition where we're going to go from our interaction design into our one factor 3-level design. And this is what that design looks like. In this case, we have only one factor. So there's only one thing that we're looking at. And so that means we're not crossing it. We're not looking at a second factor at the same time. We're just looking at one factor. And in this case, we're going to look at it as 3 different levels. So essentially 3 different conditions. Previously, we had a level 1 and a level 2. In this case, what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and add a level 3. Okay, so this makes the design a little more complex in terms of the number of conditions, but it also simplifies it because you're only looking at one factor at a time. So to have this make sense, what we'll do is we'll talk about the design that I had. Now, in the design I had 2 factors I was interested in. The group member behavior, so does a group member leave the group, stay in the group? So these first 2 conditions here. Okay, so I'll highlight these for us just a second. And I also was looking at whether that member was whether that group member that stayed or left was burdensome. That factor is no longer in my design. I've dropped it out. So what you're going to do in your situation is you're going to pick one of the variables that you looked at that you might have been interested in and say, hey, I'm going to remove that from the design. But what you're then going to do is you're going to add an additional condition. And in this case, I'm interested in what happens when the participant's ostracized by the group. Okay, so maybe having one group member leave causes a little bit of negative affect, pain, social pain, loss of basic needs, but maybe when you're ostracized entirely by the group, it feels that much worse. And so again, you guys will go ahead and pick one of your variables that you're interested in. I picked group member behavior. I then took the 2 conditions I had previously. I then added a 3rd condition, another way of comparing the effects of the group I'm interested in, group member leaving, compared to other interesting outcomes. And again, there's no other factor here for us to look at. Very simple design. So let me walk you through just a little bit more how we can process this type of design and why we're going with this type of design. So here in this case, I've listed out my negative and mood responses that I anticipate participants might have. And again, just imagining this on a 1 to 10 scale. So group member leaves, I might say, well, people start to feel a bit more negative. Okay, they feel bad that one of the group members left. Group member stays, everything is good. The participant gets ostracized by the group. This is where we say that may be the most harmful. So this may be a full version of ostracism, like we talked about in discussion. This might be more of a partial form. And what we can do with this type of design is we can make several comparisons. So the first is that we can look at what happens when we compare with the group member leaving versus staying in the group. Okay, so our first comparison there. We can also then compare a group member leaving with that group member, that participant, I should say, being ostracized by the group. So what happens when the participant's ostracized? These are our first 2 comparisons. We're comparing this experimental condition with then what happens in our control condition of staying in the group, everyone stays, versus they're ostracized by the group, and also in a different comparison group. We have a last comparison where we look at staying in the group, everyone's there, versus ostracized by the group. So this is a traditional inclusion by ostracism design. And when we get into talking about the output, you'll see why this is especially important to think about all these different comparisons between the groups. So for your task, what you're going to do is convert the 2x2 design into one factor with 3 levels. So as I hinted at before, but just to reiterate, choose one of the factors you want to investigate. Okay, so this may be the one that you feel most comfortable with, maybe the one that you found most interesting literature on in your literature search you just did. Then what you're going to do is you're going to add a second comparison group to create 3 levels. You're going to create 3 conditions that you're going to compare across each of the participants. Now, keep in mind as you select the second comparison group and the levels that you want to look at, that the manipulation or the measures need to include ostracism. Okay, so we need to have some theme of ostracism in our study. So it could be that it's something that you're measuring, could be something that you're manipulating. So the degree that they're ostracized, the type of ostracism, you can have, in fact, be both ways. Okay, so it's not only the manipulation, but also that you're measuring outcomes associated with ostracism. Okay? So for your approval, again, you can convert your design to from a 2x2 design to 1 factor with 3 levels. And again, as you're working on these things, if you have questions you want to check them through with me before kind of progressing further, always let me know. Here's what you're going to be sending to me in an email for you to get approved on. First part is that you're going to explain your overall design. You guys did this a bit before. We're going to do it again in a little more simple terms. So what is your research question? What are you looking at now that you're thinking about these 3 different conditions compared to each other? And 2, what are you hoping to learn with your study design? So how does your study design help us learn something new? So my research question is looking at what happens when a group member leaves. Okay, so rather than the participant being ostracized by the group, what happens if someone just leaves? And what I'm hoping to learn with this study design is the impact of how individuals feel when a group member leaves versus, and they're kind of stuck there, versus what happens when they're ostracized from the group. So I'm looking at, this is kind of a new form of ostracism, potentially that partial form of ostracism that we've been talking about in class. The second piece that you're going to do when you email me your steps for approval here is explain why your 2 comparison groups are good ones. Okay, so what was your rationale behind having the 2 comparison groups? So what can you learn from each comparison group between the experimental condition and each of your comparison conditions? Okay, so how are you learning something new and unique with the conditions that you posed? So in my case, I'm looking at that experimental condition of a group member leaving compared to everyone being included. So I know that that's kind of the standard experience. So I can see how negative it is to have a group member just up and leave the group. And I want to see how a group member leaving compares to being ostracized. So is it worse to have the group not interact with you versus how does it feel with just one group member leaves? Okay, so you will do a similar thing, similar to the explanation I just gave you for your assignment. So as you work on this, you can email me questions for sure. I'll respond as quickly as I can. You can ask questions during our class hours. So remember, we're going to be meeting over Zoom. I gave you guys information on how to do that. And I'll also be on Carmen, on the chat function in Carmen during office hours. So you can chat with me. We might start off first with just chatting, typing things back and forth. We might switch to a video. We can kind of do things like that. If I start to get common questions, what I'll either do is email the whole class, or I'll provide a short video to help with that response, to kind of give you more information. So lots of different ways that you can get help with. Okay? When you believe you completed the step as a group, then email me the information for my approval. Again, like I said before, I'll either give you feedback saying what you need to revise or change, or I'll sign off on it. Okay? But most importantly, with everything as we progress forward, make sure that you're staying safe, you're staying healthy, you're taking care of yourself. Realize that this class piece is only one piece of all the things that you're doing during this hectic time. So please, by all means, take care of yourself. So go ahead, make sure that you subscribe to the channel so you know when videos will be updated. And again, if you have any questions, let me know. Take care.